Being an Assyrian with half of the family from Turkey has always been a strange feeling. Barely any of the family lived back home, and all were living well off in the diaspora in Europe. Even during the early 2000s, when most Assyrians still had at least some family back home. Despite this, though, they always had the worst stories possible from back home before they came to Europe. On top of it, it's all unheard of, not just among Westerners or non Assyrians, but also by our own Assyrian community, as most of these people moved to European countries that don't really speak English whatsoever, but are actually French speaking countries. So that's what I'll talk about in this video. How did Assyrians from Turkey end up in Europe? What were the factors that would really push this community into exile within such a short time span? And before we really begin, we need to establish some basic background info to get the full picture. The Assyrian people are one of the oldest indigenous peoples of the Middle East. They are not a community that migrated from other regions to the Middle East. Their origins can be traced entirely to this geography throughout their history. The ancestors of the Assyrians laid the cultural foundation of the Middle East region through their political, religious, and cultural contributions, as well as their economic, technical, and scientific advancements, playing a pioneering role in the development of world civilization. The process of establishing political authority and a state can be traced back to 1350 BC to the Akkadians. Despite the challenges they face, this culture has managed to preserve its language, culture, and unique way of life in the same geographical region throughout history spanning at least 6,000 years. I am simplifying the ancient history a lot as it had a lot of different empires and such, but nonetheless, over the last 2,000 years since the advent of Christianity, the Assyrian people have embraced Christianity and its traditions and customs, which have become a central aspect, of the Assyrian culture. This, of course, is at a time point where they don't really have countries anymore. There are no empires or anything like that. It's just that nationality has persisted and it's adopted Christianity. And because of that, the church plays a pivotal role in guiding and educating these Assyrians. Of course, though, it hasn't been a singular church for a while because the church did split off into different churches. And these churches include the Church of the East, the Chaldean Catholic Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Syriac Catholic Church, the Melkite Catholic Church, the Syriac Maronite Church, and the Assyrian Evangelical Church. The homeland of the Assyrian people is Beth Nahrin, or what we'd call in other languages Mesopotamia. Beth Nahrin literally means the home of the two rivers, referring to the land around the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. And this homeland does encompass parts of southeastern Turkey, northeastern Syria, northern Iraq, and northwestern Iran. Of course, because of the aforementioned Christian faith the Assyrians adopted, and with Islamic conquests, particularly those of Timur, caused a lot of the Assyrian community to flee and be isolated in the mountainous regions of what is now modern southeastern Turkey. I am skipping a lot of events right now, but I will go straight into World War One to condense things for the video. After some Austrian got shot in Bosnia and the whole world threw a fit, and basically the First World War started over this. Obviously this is overly simplified and ignores a lot of details, but the point is, a war started between Germany and its allies and other European countries at the time, and the Germans pressured the Ottomans, the predecessors of modern Turkey, to join its side in the war. The Ottomans mobilized for war and declared jihad on the Allies, or the Entente, whatever the fuck you want to call it. Long story short, the war goes terribly wrong for Ottomans on the Russian front. The Battle of Sarikamish becomes a massive blunder for Enver Pasha personally, who blamed this failure on the Armenians and the non-Muslims generally. This led to Sayfo, which means sword and is to refer to the Assyrian genocide. In August 1914, the Patriarch of the Old Apostolic Church of the East, Mor Shimon ben Yamin, negotiated with the governor of Van, Jevdet, a brother-in-law of the Minister of War, Enver Pasha, about the quote-unquote neutrality of the Assyrians under his care. Despite this, though, there were massacres in October and November 1914 against the Assyrians in the east of the Ottoman Empire, in the Hakkari mountains, in Sert, Mosul area, and in northern Iran. After these events, the Patriarch declared war on the Ottoman Empire on May 10, 1915. Prior to this, in February of the same year, all Christians serving in the army were withdrawn from the front, disarmed, and transferred to work battalions, where they did forced labor as porters or in road construction, working on construction works such as the Baghdad Railway. When the work was finished, they were killed. In the Christian settlement areas, all goods were confiscated as an emergency measure to build up supplies for the army. And during these raids and house searches, the inhabitants were terrorized, and the weapons sold to Christians under duress and inflated prices were photographed and used as evidence for an alleged nationwide uprising. In June 1915, the Ottomans attacked the Assyrians with the 6th Army, led by a German for a record, and called on the Patriarch to surrender. After the negotiations with the Russians for military support failed, about 70,000 Assyrians moved with their cattle herds across the Persian border to Urmi, northwestern Iran, fleeing massacres done by the Kurdish population that was in support of the Ottomans. In the Hakkari area alone, 30,000 Assyrians were murdered in 1915 to 1916. Now, there's a lot of details I'm not really going through right now about the Assyrian resistance to all of this, and the treasonous killing of the Patriarch at a peace meeting with the Kurds, and a lot of these big details of the war after the beginning of the genocide. But there are some details about the genocide we need to kind of mention because it's very glossed over in general. Now, as briefly mentioned before, the Germans were directly involved in the genocide. They had 800 military personnel, diplomats, and advisors that were working for Ottoman. They also organized and drew the deportation plans of the Armenians. But to be fair, the Germans and Ottomans did end up losing the war. Negotiations among the victorious countries aimed to develop plans for the Middle East in order to dismantle the defeated Ottoman Empire and establish their own influence in the region according to their, respective interests. With the Paris Peace Conference, the Assyrian demands of right to self-determination faced opposition from the United Kingdom and the United States, which, led to their efforts not going anywhere. And despite Assyrians being genocided and taking on the side of the Entente or the Allies, whatever you want to call them, it meant nothing. They gained nothing from it. The Allies or the Entente began to make treaties regarding the fate of the Ottoman Empire. The West promised Assyrians to at least have a minority status under Kurdish rule, which, if you know about the genocide, the Kurds were killers. So putting their former killers right after the genocide to, rule the Assyrians made the Assyrians feel completely ignored and not really respected by any of them. However, with the Turkish War of Independence, even these treaties were abolished and they became obsolete. The Turkish victory in the War of Independence had a massive impact on the region. Mustafa Kemal's leadership and establishment of the Grand National Assembly in Ankara provided a strong platform for the Turkish nationalist movement. As the Turkish forces successfully repelled foreign interventions and asserted their independence, negotiations and discussions surrounding the Treaty of Sevres became obsolete. The treaty to take its place was the Treaty of Lausanne, which lacked legal and constitutional guarantees to Assyrians and were disregarded as an ethnic identity and subjected to policies of denial and extermination from the early years of the new Turkish Republic. Now, while the Treaty of Lausanne might have had some stuff about Christians not really being discriminated anymore, or some kind of a secular out approach. Generally speaking, though, it still stipulated that it was a Turkish republic fundamentally. So in regions such as Turabdin, Hakkari, and Urfa, where Assyrian communities were concentrated, they faced restrictions and embargoes in social, political, economic, and cultural spheres. Economic development was stifled, education in their mother tongue was denied and pretty much illegal, and the ecclesiastical administration, a unifying force for the Assyrian people, was placed under constant pressure. While the expression of religious and cultural values was forbidden, the Turkish authorities employed various methods, including land seizures, unequal treatment in courts, compulsory military service in harsh geographical conditions, even sending them to areas where they're guaranteed to die, and sometimes not even giving them weapons and just having them work all day to they're basically slaves within the military. Religious discrimination, heavy taxation, physical aggression, and policies promoting fear-based immigration to erase the existence of the Assyrian people inside of the Turkish borders. Well, the Turkish Republic was always subservient to Western capital and finance, The deep US-Turkish relations specifically came about from the Truman Doctrine. The US would dump money into the Turkish military to combat communism, not just in Turkey, but in the Middle East as a whole. After joining NATO, this was taken to another level, and the Tactical Mobilization Group was founded as part of NATO's efforts to organize a counter-guerrilla for Operation Gladio. Now, Gladio itself is a massive rabbit hole, but I'll try to summarize Gladio pretty simply. Gladio was NATO's stay-behind operations, which included assassination, psychological warfare, false flag operations to delegitimize left-wing parties in Western European countries, anti-communist militias, right-wing terrorism, as they tortured communists and assassinated them. This happened across a lot of countries, such as Italy, Belgium, Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, a lot of places had insane shit like this happening. But anyways, back to Turkey, the Tactical Mobilization Group, which was created for Gladio, was a group trained in the US for special warfare and involved recruitment by the CIA. One of these soldiers included Alparslan Türkeş, the founder of the Turkish ultranationalist Grey Wolves. The CIA also employed people from the far right, such as the pan-Turkist SS member Ruzi Nazar, to train the Grey Wolves. Nazar was an Uzbek born near Tashkent who had deserted the Red Army to join the Nazis during the Second World War in order to fight on the Eastern Front. His goal was to create a Turkestan. And, since Germany lost the war, some of its spies found haven in the US intelligence community, and Nazar was one of them. And he, funnily enough, became the CIA station chief in Turkey. Now, one of the first things this tactical mobilization group did was planning the Istanbul pogrom, which, targeted ethnic Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. Over a dozen people died during or after attacks as a result of beatings, arson, while police would do nothing. Even before the events themselves, some buildings owned by Greeks and other non-Muslim minorities were marked with the cross signs in order to make them easier for the arsons. Four-star General Sabri Yerenbejoğlu, the right-hand man of General Kemal Yamak, who led the tactical mobilization group, reminisced about his involvement in these riots, calling them a magnificent organization. The tactical mobilization group became the Special Warfare Department in 1967. Now, one thing I should also note is the fact that the leaders in Turkey didn't even know the existence of a counter-guerrilla in Turkey at all. They were only aware of this when the leader of the counter-guerrilla went up and asked the president for, funds, because the US was lagging behind, giving them money and all that. And that's how the government even became aware of their existence. And even then, they just told them to ask some other Western country for funds, which is, kind of insane that you don't even know about any of the orgs within your own country that are technically part of your government. Of course, the Special Warfare Department encouraged and protected the Turkish Grey Wolves, the far right, when they unleashed waves of bomb attacks, shootings that killed thousands of people, including students, lawyers, journalists, public officials, labor organizers, Kurds, minorities, during, the 1970s political violence that was very big in Turkey and could have swayed, Turkey to the left wing completely and shattered the role of NATO in the Middle East. Now that I've given some background info on both the Syrian issue and the issue in Turkey as a whole, I think I can finally start talking about the events that led to Assyrians leaving Turkey. Between 1962 and 1963, under the pretext of the events in Cyprus, a march was organized in the city of Midyat in Turabdin, where the Assyrians formed a majority. This march involved fanatical crowds and was organized by the counter-guerrilla with the objective of launching an attack against the Assyrians. Subsequently, the Assyrians, especially those in and around Midyat, were sporadically targeted and attacked. These provocation, oppression, and economic hardships forced Assyrians to migrate as workers and refugees, initially to Istanbul and later to Europe, which opened its doors in 1960s. Furthermore, the state also targeted monasteries and churches. In 1978, the monasteries of Mor Gabriel and Deirul Safaran, located in the province of Mardin, were closed under the pretext that these monasteries were recruiting militants for the Armenian guerrilla organization Asala. Additionally, on 29th of October 1978, Dravos Demir, a prominent figure of Kerboran, was shot in front of his gate and received 5 gunshot wounds to the chest. Following this murder, all Assyrians who remained in Kerboran emigrated to Europe, including Sweden. This migration also spread to other Assyrian villages in Turabdin, Botan, and Hakkari. With the US-backed 12th of September 1980 coup in Turkey, all these policies would be intensified far more. In 1982, Constitution introduced compulsory Islamic religious courses into schools, which had a profoundly negative impact on, because Assyrians have their Christian religious identity. Since the compulsory Islamic religious courses also included Christian students, families chose not to send their kids to, school and instead opted for emigration to Europe. This impact, combined with the systemic facilitation of migration opportunities to Europe, such as expedited passport procedures, lax controls on illegal immigration at airports, establishment of migrant networks, etc., led to significant waves of migrations to Europe in the early 1980s. During this period as well, the movable and immovable assets of Assyrians were confiscated by the Turks. On the 50th of August, the first shots that would mark the beginning of the Kurdish insurgency led by the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, against the Turkish Republic. The PKK was a new party at the time, influenced by the general communist movements across Turkey and, the world to some degree, but was now seeking to get rid of the East from the Turkish state's rule. And, the Turkish state, in response to this, deployed their army units extensively in the eastern and southeastern regions. They would introduce these checkpoints. They would, check on everyone. On top of this, they also introduced the village guard system in 1985. And village guards were also not good to the Assyrian community, and they would target them, bother them, and they functioned more as armed wings for these local tribes that were, feudal and resented a lot of the Christian minorities in the area. On top of this, Kurdish Hezbollah, which exploited religion against Assyrians and received tacit tolerance from the state, committed numerous murders and kidnappings targeting the Assyrian community. And in addition to the village guards and Hezbollah, the special forces and secret state units resorted to various oppressive tactics to force Assyrians to flee the region. Despite a lot of this, dozens of Assyrians who refused to leave their country still ended up getting massacred in 1987 and 1998. Now, the fucked up thing is as well, the Assyrians were killed between the 80s and the 90s. Their perpetrators who remain unknown, at least their names and stuff. I think most people have an idea that the Counter-Guerilla and the state had a direct hand in it, because we know that Kurdish Hezbollah, which would target Assyrians, and village guards, we know for a fact targeted Assyrians, were backed by the state, and not to a small degree either, to a deep level, with the MIT, which is the Turkish intelligence agency, being directly involved. By the 1990s, the Assyrian towns of Hakkari Botan region were emptied by the Turkish state and their allied village guards on the excuse that Assyrian population were, terrorist collaborators. What was their excuse and evidence of that? Well, they would give bread to Kurdish fighters who would ask for bread, or just any person for that matter. If anyone went up to them, asked for bread, they'd give them bread, maybe tea. And based on that excuse, entire towns were wiped out. And when I'm saying wipe, I mean like an ethnic cleansing, with the population, being kicked out of their lands, which, I don't know if that sounds familiar to any of you guys in the Middle East, kicking populations out because they're all terrorists on paper, or some dumb shit like that. But you do also have towns that were quite literally wiped out, and I'm talking about the Assyrian town of Herbole. Again, Herbole was wiped with a very silly excuse. The pretext that the Turkish state gave was, this area has coal, we want coal. So the population that remained, a lot of them had already left for record, a lot of them were expelled, they left, and the Turkish state digged up and buried the whole town. And I mean like the two churches, the spring water, everything, it all got buried by coal and dirt and all that. And if you go to Herbole today, you're not gonna see the town. There's a small neighboring little area, which, the inhabitants of Herbole have tried to fix and make it their new town, essentially, because it's still in that area. But the original town, you can still see it's like mountains of dirt and all that. You can't really see the original town anymore. And these stories aren't really that unique. You have Assyrian towns that were besieged or, entirely expelled by the military, like Hassana. Hassana had the Turkish military walk in and essentially kick them out and shoot the buildings and all that. And to be fair, I'm not saying this is something exclusive. This happened to the entire population of the southeast of Turkey. And of course, I'm simplifying the procedure of leaving your homeland and all that. And this of course led to Assyrians in mass leaving Turkey to Europe. And it had two ways. They either try to adapt to the new life, they saved up money, they started working hard, and they just wanted to get rid of that life completely, which a lot of the community there did. But you also had those who wanted to return again, attain rights, rebel, whatever, fix their life to some degree, regain their hold in their homeland. Now, you did have Assyrians who tried to rebel against the Turkish state back in Turkey in these PKK networks in Turabdin, which, as I mentioned before, is an Assyrian region. These people had ended up in the diaspora as well, having, been in prison, out of prison, all of that. But this time, they didn't want to just go rejoin the PKK and fight for this Kurdish movement. They thought that, we will need an explicitly patriotic, anti-imperialist, socialist movement to gain rights as a nation and prevent the exodus of the Assyrian community and, strike back at these conditions that Turkey had really put them in. This group was the Patriotic Revolutionary Organization of Beth Nahrin, or PRO, whatever you want to call it. It's the acronym. It sounds weird, but that's the acronym. And this group actually did pretty well in Europe, in the diaspora, because they organized protests in the diaspora for recognition of the genocide and denouncing the Treaty of Lausanne, which, put the Assyrians in this position in the first place. And yeah, these protests were massive in Europe. You can look up old clips or whatever. Even my own family took part in some of these protests, calling for, Assyrian genocide recognition and, the errors of the Treaty of Lausanne, which denied the Assyrian community any rights and all that. Of course, though, their goals were bigger than just genocide recognition and all that. These were more like common rallying points, even with the Assyrian identity issues, different dialects, different churches. This was something to rally everyone together, and they did this pretty well. And of course, it pissed off the Turkish embassy, and a lot of things were involved in this. We even had fights happening on the streets and everything. Now, one thing that's pretty ironic is, if you look at the past, the Assyrian genocide, and a lot of the genocide is, despite it being ordered by the Ottomans and it being their desire, a lot of it is done by the Kurds, the Kurdish population. Now, what's ironic about this is, at this current stage, after all this had happened in Turkey, who were the allies of this Assyrian group that had emerged from Turkey in the diaspora? It was the PKK, who, was this Kurdish movement, and they were descendants of those who had partaken in the genocide back then. The difference now was that they had recognized the genocide. They knew the role, and they called out the, feudal Kurdish lords or whatever. And they were willing to collaborate with these Assyrians because, they shared a common enemy, they shared some common ideals, and because of that, Kurdish-owned channels like Media TV in Europe at the time broadcasted Assyrian programming 12 hours free of charge. And it included news, cultural, and social programs that also promoted the cause of PRO. This might not sound crazy now, but we have to keep in mind that back then in the 90s and even early 2000s to some degree, Assyrian TV channels did not really exist. So any channel broadcasting Assyrian was a big deal and important for the diaspora who lacked the sort of media exposure and all that. Eventually, though, this led to the foundation of guerrilla units who were trained by the PKK in northern Iraq to fight the Turkish military. Because you have to keep in mind, this Assyrian group, their ultimate desire was to go back and fight, have militant fighters and everything. They couldn't really do this on their own. So when the PKK said, hey, do you want to go fight for your cause? We'll train you, we'll help you. They took it on. And yes, they did attacks, they fought, they were in the mountains, and they made a name for themselves for a while. Now, this all sounds great. You have this Assyrian revolutionary group that's, having these guerrilla army, and they're fighting the Turkish military and these collaborators, though limited to northern Iraq because they couldn't really make it to Turkey. Anyways, what happened with all of this? Now, did this go anywhere? Not really. The capture of the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan and the later US invasion of Iraq caused confusion, obviously within the PKK, but it also naturally led to confusion among this Assyrian group, which had reorganized to become the Beth Nahrin Freedom Party at this point. So what did they do? They prematurely ended the armed struggle because they thought, wholesome Changis time is coming to the Middle East, and everyone has to do it with non-violent methods, and everything will just be kind of fine, which in retrospect was a very big blunder when you take into account that things somehow became worse for that region. If you know about Iraq and Syria, these states collapsed, the Syrian population got decimated, However, though, in Turkey, with Erdogan's election and his initial pro-minority pandering, probably to secure a good track record for the EU candidacy, led to Assyrians who had moved in the 80s and 90s to Europe to finally move back. Nonetheless, though, as I said, this is kind of LARPy because Turkish state still initiated legal proceedings to seize more Gabriel monasteries and other churches, and elderly Assyrians who did move back to live there still end up being killed both in the villages of Turabdin and Hakkari Botan region. Now, not to just be like overly negative, there are some positive developments that emerged there with time though. You had the election of Erol Dora, who is from, you know, the Hakkari Botan region, and Tuma Celik, and our current, you know, lion George Aryo, and you know, all of these people ran on socialist pro-minority platforms too, and George Aryo is extraordinarily good and popular among Assyrians even outside Turkey. He stands his ground, he speaks our language in the parliament, and they will boo him for that.
Türkçe bilmeyen Süryani halkıma da Süryanice diliyle söylemek istiyorum müsaade ederseniz.
Buyurun.
Amum yatro hano gitove umablaydi uharo yodishato datralfo 23 موخا معدو كومانو عيدود مولودود موراني شو مشيحو هو بريخو لحم شو فاتريرخ داعي تاو تيذن لحسايوم علايو لقري لوز داعي تاو كله ولشوتوسه لقى بفولتيكويه وتوكوسه ولشوتوسه مردوثونويه وكنشونويه كتلي صبرو إشاتو دتر 24 هو شاتو دوشينو ببريتو دو ديلونوي هو شاتو دو عميدان دو بفوثه لدعو ردوثرو كودي ساقي genel kurulu saygıyla selamlıyorum. Çok rica ediyorum bir dakika daha hiç sataşmaya mahal vermeden.
Buyurun. Buyurun.
Mahal vermeden.
Buyurun.
Şimdi bakın biz başka bir gezegenden buraya gelmedik. Biz buranın yerleşik halklarıyız. Ben tarihimden bir örnek vereyim. Sümer, Akkad, Asur, Babil, bu toprakların 12 bin yıllık yerleşik halkıyız. Bu dil başka gezegenden gelmedi. Bu dilleri kabul edeceksiniz. Bu bir zenginliktir Türkiye için. Niye bunu kabul etmiyorsunuz? Avrupa'da bizim dilimiz okullarda resmi okutuluyor. Ya o anayasa mı bıraktınız? Anayasa çırrıha oldu. Dağıttınız, yırttınız, hala anayasadan bahsediyorsunuz. Saygılar sunuyorum sayın milletvekilleri.
He will hold his ground, he will hold his positions, he will defend our cause no matter what, he will call out the genocide openly, and he's been very good at that. You know, we're pretty proud to have him as, you know, a member of parliament representing Mardin and Turabdin as a whole, and I'd even go further, the Assyrian nation as a whole. So, you know, shout out George Aryo, our lion, the lion of Assyria, you know, God bless his soul. Now, will things get better in the future? Maybe, maybe not. I am not really optimistic about the current Turkish-Kurdish peace process, and I do believe an inevitable resumption of war and insurgency will occur. I just think that the Assyrian community needs to be ready for that environment. And when I say Assyrian community, I don't just mean the Assyrian community from Turkey that lives in Turkey, but also the broader diaspora. So the Assyrians from Iran, Iraq, Syria, that live whether in Europe, America, Australia, Russia, wherever, right? They need to have the back of Assyrians from Turkey as well. And, you know, support them, be understanding of them. You know, even if they dress differently and they speak a bit differently and they do crazy shaky dance moves with people screaming you know, they are Assyrians like everyone else. And, you know, I love them, bro. Okay, half of my family is that, and yeah, they're Assyrians. Like, what am I supposed to say? And, you know, I hope that things will get better and we can at least look back and see what led to this position in the first place. Anyways, I know this was a more of a serious video, but this is not really something anyone has really talked about, and I've tried to like simplify it, make it digestible for, you know, bigger audiences, whether they're, you know, just Assyrians tuning in, maybe a bit lefty, maybe a bit righty, I don't know. But anyways, like, comment, and subscribe to bring back the patriotic revolutionary organization of Bet Nahrin to do guerrilla attacks on Turkish Grey Wolf Eagles.
Hon kallar mig robot, hon fick metal i sig. Här vi döljer ingenting, hon ville ha BBC.